Hello, and a big warm welcome to you from wherever in the world you are today. This is Kevin Jackson from Trilio. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy day to join us for our bi-weekly Ask the Expert series focused on cloud-native data protection. I see a number of our regulars are back. It's great to see you again. But for the new people, our aim is to provide relevant topics and discussion around various data protection challenges in a quick 30-minute lightning talk style format. We'll do our best to stick to the time, but cloud native backup is our strong point. Clearly timing isn't. We'll default everyone to mute. John can heckle with the best of them, but we don't have much time to deal with those unruly ones at the back. I can see you. That said, we do want to keep it interactive, so submit questions at any time in the chat box directly to me, and we'll get to them at the end. With that, today's topic is on RPO and RTO, and maybe some other acronyms to keep you on your toes. Speaking of toes, over to you, John Tobin.
Wow, Kev, you've outdone yourself yet again. Whoever said the English weren't inventive was wrong. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. As Kevin said, my name's John Tobin. Let me run you through a quick agenda for today. So we'll do a quick intro on the series, and then we'll get into the meat of the discussion. So we'll talk a little bit about backup and recovery and the considerations that you should make for RPO and RTO, what the value of backups are, and then specific considerations around RPO, RTO, and a new acronym, I guess, that I'm coining, but I think it's been out there for a long time, called RRO. And then we'll go into some recommendations, and as always, Q&A. So our Ask the Experts series, as Kev said, is a bi-weekly discussion on various backup and recovery topics, and we've just extended it for a few more weeks, so you can come in here. Kevin and I pontificate on different things. Interaction is encouraged, so please ask us questions, bring your challenges, concerns, advice, things you've seen. This is an open forum. You could submit those directly to Kevin Jackson, as he said, and the person that's most actively engaged at the end of the presentation will win a $50 Amazon gift card, and Kevin will announce that. So on to us. As you heard, Kevin Jackson is our senior solutions architect. Kev's got a ton of experience, is a great guy, and is also quite funny, as you can tell. And he's in a mirror. There you go, Kev, a little spin action for you. And I am John Tobin. I am the solutions architect here in the Americas. So let's talk a little bit about RPO and RTO. So RPO, I'm sure most of the people on this call are probably familiar with it, but basically it's how much data are you willing to lose, right? And that's going to determine your frequency of backups. So if you can only lose 12 hours of data, well, you have to back up at least every 12 hours, if not sooner than that. And so that will help you determine how often do you need to back up. And then there's the RTO, right? It's how quickly do you need your application back up and running. And that will determine basically your restore priority. But the funny thing about RTO that's different than RPO is that usually it will include not only the data, so not only the restore of the maybe virtual infrastructure like VMs or containers and the data, but then also the application. And where the rubber really meets the road is things like databases, right? If you're taking a crash consistent backup and you want to recover that, that's great. You can recover the VM, you can recover the data, but then the database needs to start up. A lot of times it's going to need to go through a crash recovery process. And depending on how granular your backups are, so what your RPO was, that crash recovery can take a long time. I spent a lot of time in MySQL and in MongoDB, and it can take hours, sometimes even close to a day, depending on what kind of database you're talking about. So this can be a significant impact, and that also will impact your SLA and your commitments back to your business partners. And then the last one that I guess I'm coining, I don't know, Kevin seems to think I am. I don't really think this is new. Maybe I'm just terming it, but recovery resource objective. And I like to think of this as how many resources do you have to be able to dedicate to backups and restores in any one period of time. And what's really important about this, I think today, and thinking of this as like a gigantic pie, is we're in a cloud use case for most applications today, right? And that's just logical separation, right? We're all drawing from the same pool of resources. And, you know, when one of us proverbially decides to pee in the pool, everybody gets affected by it, right? And so if you think of the amount of resources you have as 100%, every time you decide to back up an application, so you decide on an RPO for an application, you take up part of that pool of resources. And so per unit of time, that pool of resources is only so big. So every time I guarantee to put another SLA in there for either backups or recoveries, I'm detracting from that pool. And I have to think of this in terms of a pool because I can only do so much work. And when it comes to things that are very important, like RTO and the actual restore of my backups, I can only commit to do so much. Otherwise, I fail everybody that's in that pool. And that's a very important thing to be thinking about. How many resources do I have available for me to be able to do this? And can I be successful with the commitments that I've made back to the business? Because that's what it's all about. And so we always like to keep it lighthearted here. So, right, there's a lot of people that think that they don't need to back up. And as Willy Wonka here would tell you, that's a genius plan for data loss. But really, what's the value of a backup? And, you know, like life insurance, backups and life insurance have no value unless something dies. And I pay for life insurance. I certainly hope I absolutely throw away all that money and I never need it. But backups are the same way, right? We do back up in case something happens. We hope we're never going to need them. But man, when it comes time to restore, boy, are they valuable, right? And so when you're thinking about how do you back up and why do you back up, right? RPO is a pretty important consideration for that. But not everything can be backed up all the time. And so, you know, if we just said, hey, you know what, we have 3 SLAs, one's a 24-hour SLA, one's a 12-hour SLA, and the other one's a 4-hour SLA. And we don't talk to our customers about the benefits and drawbacks or the resources, the RRO that we have available to us. Everybody's going to say, well, 4 hours is 8 times better. You know what I mean? 4 hours is way better, or at least 6 times better anyways, my math is bad, than a 24-hour SLA. So why don't I just do 4 hours, right? Why wouldn't you make that decision? Well, because you can't do everything, right? You can't back up everything all the time. And so business priority is important, right? You have to talk to your business partners. If you know you're just a backup admin, talk to them about what's the business priority of this application, right? And this comes from the entire business, not just one application owner. But also things like size. How much data do I have to back up? How much data do I have to restore, right? How many resources is this going to take for me not only to back up, but also restore, right? The complexity of that application, right? What does this comprise of? How many VMs are inside of this application? How many containers, right? Is this microservices? These things get very complex sometimes, and you have to know what the dependencies are. Also, the rate of change, right? Some databases are written to an astronomical number of times every second, right? And so you're going to be backing up a lot of data sometimes, even if you're doing granular backups or snapshots. That can be pretty invasive. SLOs and SLAs. A lot of these things have been in place for a long time and don't tend to get reviewed. And you may be a subject of some SLOs or SLAs that haven't been reviewed in years, probably written long before you got to the company, right? And so these things do have to be revisited, and you have to think, what have things changed, right? Have we gone to a microservices architecture from something that was very monolithic before? That's going to affect our ability to be able to meet the objectives and agreements we have in place. Also, resource utilization. We've talked about it a lot, but how many resources do I have available? Because if everybody's choosing that 4-hour SLA, well, chances are I don't have any resources available to be able to meet that SLA anymore because my backup window is too small, possibly, right? Do you have enough time to be able to back up everything, right? I used to talk to a lot of customers back when I was working for EMC that could never meet their backup windows, right? They could never meet that 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. backup window that they had, right? Instead, backups were taking them all the way to 8 o'clock in the morning. They were missing their SLA every day and they didn't know what to do, right? Can you find a better way to back up? is there a better backup solution, a more efficient backup solution out there? And lastly, a good way to help the business make decisions is to do things like showback, to account for the resources that it takes to meet this SLA, because it helps them understand that there is a trade-off here about the decisions that you're making together. So now on to RTO. What should we be considering? Well, not everything can be recovered quickly, just like not everything can be backed up all the time, right? And we talked about it before when we were talking about RPO, but there are a lot of dependencies for applications. They've become very complex because they're not monolithic anymore. There's a lot of things that people don't understand. We talked about it in NFV 2 weeks ago when we were talking about it. Service chains. A lot of these services depend on each other. And if you want to get an application back up and running, you have to restore all of those services. So there's some complexities involved here, right? File system application consistency. I gave you the use case before when we were talking about RTO, 2 slides back, about databases and going through crash recovery, right? Am I getting consistent backups that will reduce my crash recovery times for things like file systems or applications? Resource availability, right? It's the thread running through all this, and the reason why I coined the term, according to Kevin, RRO, right? It's important to know how many resources do I have available. There's just not enough network bandwidth. Physical get you every time. We talked about that last talk as well. And there's automation. Can some of this be automated, right? Is it easy enough for a human being to kick this off and let it run? And also, is my automation reliable, or is it going to break? Because you don't need another thing to troubleshoot while you're trying to recover applications, right? And then the type of outage. This one's pretty important because it's going to determine how many resources you have to throw into that proverbial pool, right? If we're talking about a widespread outage, like some sort of disaster where a data center goes down, you're going to have a lot of things that have to restore, right? And that's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of resources, and everybody's going to be running around like their hair is on fire. It's going to be really stressful. It's really difficult. But if it's a local outage, maybe just one application, you're going to have more time. You're going to have more resources, and people will be less harried trying to restore the application. So these things are important to take into effect as well when you're agreeing to SLAs. And then so RRO, really what is this all about? I like to think of it like Newton's third law of motion. And if you don't know anything about it, it's, for every reaction, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So things are, basically force pairs. And so when you take a piece of that resource pool away, it has an opposite reaction on everybody else that's in that pool, right? And so resource contention is going to affect your backup and your restore times. Like we talked about, if network bandwidth is completely maxed out, there's no way you're going to be able to restore another application in that time frame. The data will just never copy across the network. Same thing for CPU, memory, even people time, right? And so people, like, trying to make this a self-service feature is always best, right? To be able to put the power back in the hands of the application owners is a big thing, especially for them, because it feels like they are empowered, right? And it also gives you back resources. That's a little bit less work you have to do, maybe a little bit more work up front to be able to enable a self-service dashboard or an integrated UI, but that's the power of integrated solutions. And then there's also the tech, right? Your network, do you have enough bandwidth? Storage, also bandwidth, response times are important there. And then compute, do I have enough CPU, enough memory, wherever it might be to be able to get these things done? Because as we know, computer systems start to break down when you get to 80% utilization sometimes. And so let me give you, some guidelines that I think, we like to use at Trilio, and we talk to customers quite a bit about. And so the 80-20 rule is, if I'm looking at all of my applications and all my SLAs, and how often do I have to back them up from, let's just say, an RPO perspective here. A lot of times, if you look at the whole data set, roughly about 80% of your RPOs should fall in the 24-hour or greater time frame, right? Just as a distribution, it should be roughly in that ballpark, because if you are not, then you're going to have an issue with the amount of resources you have to put towards backups, right? People are just pushing you probably a little bit too far, and backups are just going to be too much of that resource pool that we've been talking about. And then for that other 20 piece, it's going to tear out something like 15-5, right? 15 might be a 12-hour SLA and 5 might be less than that, like a 4-hour SLA or something like that. So there's going to be some tiering involved there. And then for RPO, right? Layering protection is always a great idea, right? And then considering the cost, right? The accountability that I was talking about before for the SLAs and the chargeback and showback. So, when you do have applications that need, a 4-hour backup plus, you probably can get that done with backups, but you might want to layer in some snapshots too. And there's going to be a lower cost associated with that when you're going back to your customers. And then for things that are less than 4 hours, a lot of times it's great to layer in snapshots, right? That gives you that point in time restorability, but snapshots, they're not backups, right? A lot of times they're pointer based and they're pointing right back to production storage. And so there's some risk involved there. So you always want to be backing up too at maybe roughly about a 4-hour interval. That's usually the least that I'll recommend to our customers is say, look, if you're going to be backing up less than 4 hours, think about using snapshots instead of backups for that less than 4-hour granularity, and then taking a backup every 4 hours, right? That gives you plenty of time to take backups, but also gives you the restorability of snapshots and a finer grained RTO. And then for less than 1 hour or about 1 hour, things can get pretty complex. There are a lot of solutions out there that can help you with this, but you got to think about things like front end high availability. You got to think about things like, back end disaster recovery and data replication, whether it be synchronous or asynchronous, and then also backups in there, right? It's important to layer your protection strategies in case some unforeseen situation is going to strike you. And then for RTO, right? Recovery is really where your money's earned, right? So we already talked about that. Backups are a great insurance policy, but they're only really valuable when something dies. And so RPO and RTO are related, right? If somebody picks a low RPO for their application, they're also probably going to expect a low RTO as well, right? Those two things tend to be tied together. So that's why it's important to keep roughly 80% of those applications in the 24+ hour period. One, because they're probably not that mission critical where they can't withstand some data loss, right? And this doesn't happen that often, of course. So it's important to be able to be putting your resources where it really matters for the business. And that goes into developing those SLAs, right? Give people a menu to pick for them. It makes it easier and help them understand how this affects the business and how it affects your department as well, right? How many resources do you have to put toward actually achieving this SLA for that business partner, and show them the cost of doing that. It's okay. And then when it comes to recovery plans and SLAs, I recommend that you test twice a year. These recovery plans, I've seen more times than I can count, businesses that have spent a ton of time and resources in their recovery plans. They've tested them once, and then they put that recovery plan in a big 3-ring binder on a shelf somewhere, and it never gets tested again until there's a disaster. And man, is that a really difficult thing to talk about when you have to go back to your boss and say, I can't recover anything. We hadn't tested the recovery plan in a long time, and it turns out it wasn't pertinent anymore, right? That's a bad time to come to that realization. So test. Is it easy? It's not always. It's not always easy, but it's a great thing to do, and it's important for the business as well. And in an unforeseen situation, it will really make things easier on you, your staff, and the whole business. So that really rounds out my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, but I don't think I got any Venmo payments from the last one, so I feel like I'm in arrears now. So if you guys could just Venmo me, that'd be great. And I'll turn it over to you, Kev. Please submit your questions to Kevin.
Yeah. So we've got a few. One of them is probably just a little bit of clarification needed because they did come in just as you were explaining some of these topics. But if you can just clarify RRO, and is it how much resource is needed to implement basically backup and recovery? Is that the view? Is that the one line or from RRO?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's basically the view. But I mean, there are other things that go into that as well, because, when it comes to things like RPO, right, you're doing that sometimes during production hours, right? And so you have to think, am I pulling away from my production resources as well? Like, do I have my own backup network? Like, are these resources just dedicated to backups, or might they have some sort of effect on production workloads? And that's how backup windows are come about, because they're done on the least busy time of the day always. So there are some other things when you're thinking about RRO that might have an effect on even production workloads.
So does it come down to I say effective planning?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Another one, probably going like really, but the sucker punch. Is it technically possible to get RTO or RPO to 0?
Ooh, that's a great question. Well, yeah, it is. But you're not actually talking about recovery, right? You're talking about HA. There are a lot of applications that are architected that way today. I mean, I don't know if you have different view, Kev, but usually it requires, like some sort of front end load balancer, and then my data replicated everywhere. But sometimes that requires, a regional outage trade-off. I don't know. What are your thoughts there, Kev?
Yeah, I think that's a much bigger topic. I mean, the whole idea of RTO and RPO or those kind of metrics is the fact that there is a lag in terms of the recovery, whereas technical, like you said, a 0 lag in any recovery is fault tolerance. So that's I think that's kind of like stretching the discipline, just like maybe one step a little too far. I mean, obviously it's certainly in the camp because it's the topic of redundancy. But yeah, I mean, I guess it all comes back to the one thing. Ultimately, this is about making sure your business is up and running. And in some situations, the failover fault tolerance is immediate. In other situations, it's actually acceptable to not have that investment needed, but to actually have a recovery process. And they're all equally valid approaches.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And I would think, I think we've all seen some situations, whether it be, a Netflix or Google had a really bad outage and like Google Fi went down a couple of years ago, where you have these applications that are technically architected bulletproof, right? They're completely highly available and they're fault tolerant, just like you're talking about, Kev. But something else happened. Like in Google's case, I believe it was the Kubernetes control plane network became busy and they couldn't issue any commands at all to Kubernetes. So that brought down everything. Their network was completely taxed and they had never architected around that. And that's a case where a backup could have been highly, highly valuable, because you can spin up a whole another pod, a whole new cluster, and a bunch of resources somewhere else to be able to get that application back up and running, instead of having to try to do some crazy troubleshooting. So I think even in those cases, you should still be worried about protecting yourself.
Yeah, I think maybe this is another topic for the future, but I mean, there are platforms out there which kind of lead you down the path of, hey, look, everything's all highly available, everything's all fault tolerant, until it isn't. And in those situations, you're very dependent on, say, the service provider, whereas, we're specifically discussing how you can take back control of those situations.
Mm-hmm.
Another one, do integrated backup platforms, obviously like Trilio, actually have any impact on what you've been talking about today, John?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sure. I mean, yeah, so self-service was something we talked about. So an integrated backup platform is really important for things like self-service, right? That gives you more resources back to that resource pool, right? It affects your RRO. Not only that, it gives people the comfort of knowing that things are, one, protected, they can see their backups, and two, they can restore them themselves, which is another important thing. And then also integrated backup platforms, from what I've seen pretty much across the industry, and is also the case with Trilio, are much more efficient when it comes to platform resources. So, you have agnostic solutions like agents, right, which you could pop in every VM, but then each one of those agents has its own CPU and memory footprint. And that breaks down when you're in cloud-like use cases. Whereas when you don't need to use an agent, that CPU and that memory is dedicated to hundreds of VMs at one time. And so it's a much more resource efficient way of doing a backup when it comes to CPU and memory and even network bandwidth in the cloud, which are all very valuable resources. Do you have any thoughts there, Kev?
No, I agree. No, it's all. No, I can't think of any additional things. One last question, just looking at the time. I'll read it out verbatim. Which is the best practice to expose the cost of RTO RPO? And we just almost touched on this now, but a little slant. RTO RPO per to user, if we expose them a self-service portal for backup. So tacking on to the end of what you've just said.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that I have a great answer for it. I think one, it can be kind of difficult to determine sometimes, and to actually show it back, right? It's going to be, you can take a swag at it and kind of include it in your SLA, but it's going to be really dependent on each application that you have to do it. So it's kind of custom. Right. And so, really what you need to know is how much does each resource cost me? How much does each VM, right? This is like kind of the cloud use case. It comes down to, what's the cost for you to give a service back to a customer? And it can be, kind of hard to determine sometimes. You probably have a little bit more experience there than I do, Kev, actually.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, all these are features, and again, it's all about providing a service. Certainly that's where we go in. It's not a case of we're a function to restore the data in the event of a disaster. Obviously, that's just the low-hanging fruit, but the value of self-service within an integrated platform is the fact that genuinely that's value. How you expose the cost. I mean, look, it's backup as a service in my head. How we define that at the back end, or a service provider exposes that at the back end. I mean, I would see them as features. But yeah, certainly I would see them as expected features, though. So I would just see this as an enhancement to a service provider. Looking at the time, I think this is one of the ones where we've actually nearly, met the requirements of sticking to the schedule. So I applaud you, John, and thank you to everybody on the call. I'm just going to announce the winner. The winner of the gift card this week is a Keith Stenning. So we'll email you, Keith, with the details of your gift card. And then next time, as you can see, on July the 16th, I will be talking all things Red Hat OpenStack, Rev, and OpenShift, and the challenges you face on each of those platforms, and where backup and recovery comes in to play on each of them. So thank you very much for your time today, and we will see you in a couple of weeks.